Well, here we are. We are now on chapter 28, 28.3. We have reached the end here of the Vietnam era. So we're going to cover over a few end notes that really are important when we're getting out of Vietnam, and also how the United States is now interacting on the world stage. So you're going to see some changes in policy of how we work because of the Nixon administration. So we're just going to jump right into this. We'll try to see if we can wrap this one up pretty quickly. That way, when it comes to Thursday, you'll have plenty of time to review for the test on Friday. So let's jump into this here. So one of the things that we look at when it comes to Nixon is accommodation. That's what he really looks to do on the world stage. He's already trying to get America out of the quagmire of Vietnam, and he's really trying to reassert America's role on the world stage, but also trying to soothe over some of the relationships that America has distanced itself from or has had a lot of problems with. Mainly those are the communists is what we're going to be looking at. Now, one of the things that they look at doing furthermore is Nixon really wants to expand trade out. He's also willing to negotiate and see if they can reduce and lower down the nuclear arsenals from each country, try to stabilize the world. They start a program or an idea called détente. Yes, it looks like détente. It's not. It's French. It's détente. Basically, it is to reduce tension in the world. Nixon really wants to be seen as a president that tries to establish peace throughout the country. So that's the big thing here with Nixon and his foreign policy. And lastly, if you guys remember from our last unit too, I talked about this really briefly, but Nixon and Kissinger, they want to really kind of bring China a little closer to the United States and push it away from the Soviet Union. Now, there's already been tension between the two countries. They're not necessarily getting along as communist buddies, but at the same time, they are both communist in nature and trying to expand communist influence within their spheres. So you have like your Stalinists, your Maoists, you have your Leninists, you have your Marxists, you have the whole gambit of communism trying to spread its wings out from each of these mainline communist countries. And so Nixon really tries to soothe relationships with China, because remember, they've been really frosty, and we go everywhere from Korea to the fear of them coming into Vietnam. So the United States and China do not have a great track record. And if you remember, one last thing is that China does not have a seat on the Security Council in the United Nations because Taiwan has it, because the United States recognizes Taiwan as the legitimate government of China. So Nixon really looks to how can he fix these things. So the first thing is that he says, all right, we get that Taiwan not really the true Chinese government in a sense. We recognize Taiwan as having a legitimate government in there, but we believe that China deserves its spot on the Security Council. So the United States kind of follows a one China policy, but not quite. We still back Taiwan. So it's a really kind of tricky situation that Nixon gets himself into, but he pushes Kissinger out there to kind of defrost those relationships. And then Nixon himself actually goes to China and really starts to work out how they can improve trade negotiations, and also to tell how the United States is willing to work with China to bring them to a greater presence on the international stage, especially in the United Nations. So we really start to trade with China. This opens up the doorway between Chinese and American trade that even exists to this day. As you're probably well aware of, we get a lot of our products from China. And so the other thing, too, is that China does get to take its role and its seat in the Security Council and have a veto vote. So that is also a very important thing for China to be able to get in order to establish himself as a true world player. Now, again, the United States does not abandon Taiwan. In fact, we still to this day supply them and sell them huge amounts of military hardware. We also buy a lot of products from Taiwan, too. So it's a really sticky situation that the United States finds itself in, where it tries to maintain that, yes, the communist government is a legitimate government, but at the same time, we still view Taiwan as having the true government of China, and we're constantly trying to balance that idea out with our foreign policy, even still to this day. Furthermore, Nixon tries to look at how can we build better relationships with the Soviet Union. So he's looking at ways to soothe over those relationships, to try to bring down the temperature. Well, if you're talking about the Cold War, just try to get rid of the Cold War, but it's not really going to happen. We're still going to maintain the Cold War no matter what here, but really pull those fingers back from the button, I guess is a better way to put it here. Make sure we don't jump into nuclear annihilation. And so a few things they do is that they first off open up additional trade. The main thing that the United States trades with the Soviet Union, and for many years trades with them, is wheat. We sell them a lot of our farm produce and also what we farm in our country, because the Soviets, one thing they're really bad at is projecting how much food they actually need to feed their citizens, and so they create these 5 and 10-year farming plans that often fall short of meeting their goals. So they buy a lot of food from the United States. We also improve and try to bring manufacturing ideas to them. They allow a Ford manufacturing plant to open up in their country. So as you can see, the United States is trying to use its power as a capitalistic country to ease over relationships with the hardcore communists and show them that, yes, they can work together in certain senses. And you start to see some of the cooperation also in the space program start to happen between the two countries in the 1970s. You start to see joint programs where they try to latch up with pods together, really trying to make space a place for everybody, not make it a military mission. The space race at this point, by the time we hit the moon, for the most part, the space race is over. So there's no dramatic pushes any further here. Another thing the United States does is help them with their oil exploration, something that the Russians still to this day use quite effectively. They're a major producer of oil in the region. In fact, they sell a lot to Europe, and natural gas goes to Europe quite a bit too from Russia. All right, and then lastly, they engage in what are known as the SALT I talks. Yes, the reason why it's called SALT I is because there's additional SALT talks. When they first met, it wasn't SALT I, it was just SALT. But SALT I talks is what we know as it today, which is a strategic arms limitation treaty, why it is SALT. And the things that we start looking at is how can we reduce nuclear stockpiles? Can we retire former older weapons systems? It opens the doorway for future negotiations. There's not dramatic decreases under the SALT I, but it opens up the door for SALT II, where you start to see reductions in nuclear arsenals. All right, let's talk really quickly about the Middle East. United States, of course, we start showing a vested interest in the Middle East once huge oil reserves are found, because we know that oil powers the American economy. We use their oil from everything from our automobiles to making plastics. Most people don't realize that you need oil in order to make plastics, and also for other refined chemical uses. So once oil is really pumping out of the Middle East, the United States really becomes invested into what is happening in the Middle East, as it is supplying 50% of the world's oil supply and giving the United States 40% of its own oil supply. Actually, today we no longer have a lot of those issues where it comes to oil supply, because we are not nearly as reliant as we used to be on Middle Eastern oil. And there's a reason for that, and we're about to go over why the United States takes that position. The other thing they create is something called OPEC. And this is basically an oil cartel. In the United States, this would be illegal, but in the world stage, it is not. It's a collection of high producers of oil, and they work together to fix oil prices to a certain extent to make sure that they all stay profitable. They are not doing that whole supply demand measurement and having them compete against each other. Instead, they're all working together in order to stabilize the price of oil between them, so they make sure all of them are making a lot of money. And that's what they do with the OPEC. And OPEC is still around today, still exists, and still is really profitable for all countries involved in OPEC. So America also becomes further involved in when we're looking at the Middle East is with Israel. And Israel is a constant hot point within the Middle East. The capital city of Jerusalem, or historical capital city of Jerusalem, is claimed by three major religions. I know I pointed out that it's two major religions, but Christianity is definitely involved in Jerusalem. But for the matter of this PowerPoint and this slide that we're working with, it's the Jews and the Muslims really have dueling claims over like the Temple Mount and other important religious areas throughout the city. And this really creates a lot of conflict and problems, especially in 1948 when Israel declares their independence. And right after they do that, the Arab-Israeli War kicks off too. And within a few days, Israel manages to push back a large grouping of a coalition of Middle Eastern countries that try to basically take the state of Israel out of existence. The Israelis managed to push them out, though, and secure their now new homeland. Shortly, in a few years after that, there is the 1967 Six-Day Wars. Again, the Arab states try to attack Israel. Again, Israel soundly beats them back. In fact, they take control over large sections of some of the Middle Eastern countries, especially Egyptian territory that the Egyptians aren't overly happy about. And Israel controls that for a while and creates kind of buffer zones for themselves. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War also kicks off. Israel, again, is victorious. In all reality, if you study the Yom Kippur War, it's the first time that Israel is caught really flat-footed, and they do not do well at the opening stage of the war, but they manage to come back and are able to push most of the Arab states again back out of the territories that Israel had controlled. Interesting thing about the United States, when it comes to Israeli policy, we do not get involved in their wars in the sense that we don't supply manpower, we don't directly involve our military. Like, we don't bring fighter pilots in to bomb locations and territories. We do not take a Vietnam approach when it comes to our dealings with Israel. Instead, we're mainly there to supply weapons, and monetary support is usually how the United States backs Israel. So this does create hostility, though, in the Middle East with how the United States does provide the support to Israel. So how can they hit back the United States? Obviously, they don't have the ability to project military power to strike at the United States. So instead, they hit America economically. Remember OPEC? Well, what they decide to do is they initiate an oil embargo on the United States. So they stop shipping the United States from October 1973 to 1974, and this creates a major problem in the American economy. This is the very first time you start seeing gas shortages. So you were rationed to how much gas you could get. Some people couldn't get gas at all because the gas stations simply would run out of gas. People often were waiting in long lines in order to even approach a gas station and get gasoline. A fascinating outcome that happens because of the gas shortages, though, is Americans start buying more fuel-efficient vehicles from places like Korea and Japan. This is where like Toyota finds its way into the American market, because Americans are starting to look at it going, well, I can't have this large, beefy, huge engine automobile anymore. It uses up too much gas. What happens if we find ourselves in an oil embargo again? I need something that's going to be fuel efficient and take me longer distances. That's what really brings to birth the mid-size car with good fuel economy. Interesting thing that comes out of this. Another thing that they do is they raise the price of oil extremely by over 350%. That's why you see the costs go up dramatically of how much gasoline costs during this time frame. What happens is after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Kissinger goes over and he tries to work together with Israel and many of the Arab states to have Israel give back some of the territory that had been conquered, to try to forge some sense of peace in the region. There are numerous peace meetings between Israel and Arab states. Most famous, of course, are like the Camp David Accords. That occurs, but we're going to talk more about that in our next unit, okay? But we'll also cover how economically this gas shortage really impacts the American economy. All right, that's all there is for this one. Shorter than normal, but we are going to move into a review and tomorrow, and then we're going to prepare for the test on Friday. Make sure you are studying the map. I'm going to provide a study guide tomorrow. I'll make up a study guide PowerPoint. Make sure you do those two together so that you're prepared. All right, thanks for joining me, guys, and we'll see you next time.